Robyn Chuter, welcome back to the Plant Yourself podcast.
Thanks for having me back again.
Yeah. So we were going to talk about ketogenic diets, and you wrote what amounts to a book in.
I think I might end up getting it published. There was a lot of work that went into that.
Yeah, I mean, it's on your website. Which tell us what it is, so people can go pause and listen and go read it for themselves, and then come back and listen to us.
It's now a 6-part series. It started out a 3-part series, and then it just kind of like Topsy, it just grew, and it's now a 6-part series on the ketogenic diet. So each part kind of focuses on one element of the ketogenic diet, all the claims made for it. For example, does the ketogenic diet cure cancer, cure diabetes? And then the last part that I wrote, which is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart, is what does the ketogenic diet do to the gut microbiome?
Mm-hmm. So before we jump in, what's your website so people can go find it for themselves?
Oh, yes. It's empowertotalhealth.com.au. I am in Australia, as you can guess by the accent, so don't forget the .au. So EMPOWER, empower, and then totalhealth.com.au.
Beautiful. So I'll include links to the to all 6 parts in the show notes. So before we get into it, I'm curious why the gut microbiome is near and dear to your heart.
It's absolutely fascinating, and I love to geek out on research. I'll geek out on any research. I geek out on behavioral research. I geek out on biological research. I just geek out on research. And the gut microbiome is just so incredible in terms of the effect that it has on our behavior, on our food preferences, on our disease risks, and let's just say the impact of the ketogenic diet on the gut microbiome is not good. Obviously, there is a lot still to be discovered about the gut microbiome. We don't yet know exactly what constitutes a healthy gut microbiome, but the changes that are seen in the gut microbiota of people who go on carb-restricted, high-fat diets, it really in the opposite direction to the patterns that we see as being associated with health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's reminding me like of a friend who was a hippie in the 60s, and he was writing about the Altamont Music Festival, which happened a little bit after Woodstock. This was on the West Coast, and Woodstock was, of course, 3 days of peace and music, and like 500,000 people, no violence. Altamont, there was deaths, there was violence, there was terror. Yeah. And it turns out that like the main cause, according to people who were there and who were part of it, was the decision by the concert promoters to hire Hell's Angels motorcycle gang to be the security. And
wow, that's an interesting choice.
And to pay them in beer. And kind of that's what I'm thinking about with the microbiome. That, so there's so many more of them than us, like in terms of the microbes in our bodies. Like I've heard, 100 trillion, like 10 times more of them, of their cells than our cells. I don't know what the percentage of DNA,
there is 100 to 150 times more microbial DNA than human DNA in the human body. Which is extraordinary. Yeah.
All right. So it's like, who do I want? Defending me? Do I want a bunch of drunken Hell's Angels, or do I want qualified security personnel, going around and policing my body?
Yeah, that's a really striking analogy, actually. And I even like that the fact that the Hells Angels were paid in beer. It's kind of like we pay our microbiota in leftover food. Okay, so in other words, they're mostly down there in the colon, living off the scraps, you might say. Anything that we don't manage to digest and absorb in the small intestine ends up in the large intestine, the colon, where the gut microbiota get to have a go at it. And so depending on what you pay them in, that determines who will grow. if you pay them in lots of fiber and plant polysaccharides and polyphenols from your whole food plant-based diet, then what grows is the bugs that are just metabolically, genetically adapted to living off those wages, if you like. And if you pay them in the amounts of fat and protein that people eat, particularly on the more, I suppose, the more modern adaptations of the ketogenic diet, which is beyond what a human being could possibly absorb. So those leftovers end up paying types of bacteria down in the gut that ferment protein and also that break down bile, or that just flat out eat fat. And I mean, I've never thought of them as Hell's Angels, but that's actually a really good analogy.
Right. I just want to make sure I'm clear. I don't have anything against Hell's Angels. Just
Hell's Angels are lovely, I'm sure.
Yeah, I just just didn't work out at Altamont in the late '60s.
No, apparently not.
So we know that the gut microbiome changes based on what we're feeding it, and if we're doing this ketogenic diet, they're getting a very, very specific set of nutrients that determine their makeup. Let's start from the very beginning, because one of the things I loved about your 6-part series is that essentially parts 1 and 2 are the basics. So before, like,
yes.
So I I play on an old men's sports team. So a lot of these guys are doing keto, as they say, and we can argue about it, but nobody knows what anyone's talking about. So let's go to first principles and tell us, like, what does ketogenic mean? What are ketone bodies? Why do we even have them in the first place? And what's their evolutionary significance for our health?
Absolutely. Well, the ketogenic diet was developed back in 1924. It goes back a long way. And a doctor by the name of Russell Wilder, who was at the Mayo Clinic, had come across research that fasting actually put people who were epileptic out of their seizures. And this research on seizure disorders being essentially, you might say, cured by fasting went back as far as 1910. And Wilder hypothesized that ketone bodies that were generated during this anti-seizure effect. So that was great. But of course, as we all know, you can't fast forever. Eventually, you're going to run out of food and you die, or you run out of bodily reserves and you die. And this applies particularly to children. And he was concerned that he was seeing epileptic children. They weren't responsive to the anti-seizure medications that are available at the time. They're what are called drug-resistant epilepsy or refractory epilepsy. And so he hypothesized that if he could put them on a diet that generated ketone bodies, that might have the same effect on epilepsy as actually fasting. And it turned out that he was right. So he developed what was known as, what is now known, because there are so many versions of it, as the classic ketogenic diet. And this was a diet that was 6% protein, 4%, this is on the basis of calories, so 6% calories from protein, 4% calories from fat, and of course the remaining 90% was carbohydrate. And there have since been several...
Wait a minute, I thought it was almost no carbohydrates.
Oh, sorry, 90% calories from fat is what I meant to say.
Okay, so 4%.
Fat. Yep, 90% fat, 6% protein, 4% carbohydrate.
Gotcha.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yep. All right. And it worked fairly well. It doesn't work for every child with refractory epilepsy, but for those for whom it works pretty well. And they would have to be on the diet for anywhere from several months to a year or so. And once they were seizure-free, then carbohydrates were slowly reintroduced back into their diet. And, on the whole, they remained seizure-free. And since then, a number of variants on that classic ketogenic diet have been developed for the treatment of epilepsy that allow a little more carbohydrate, but they still are extremely low carbohydrate diets.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what's the biology of ketones and all this?
Yeah, okay. Well, I think most people are aware that the primary fuel of really most cells in the human body is glucose. And this is particularly true of the brain. The brain's really very heavily dependent on a constant supply of glucose. When we eat, if we eat carbohydrates, that is, our blood sugar level goes up, and the brain's then able to run off the carbohydrate that's available just from the meal that you ate. But the liver starts kind of withdrawing, you might say, withdrawing glucose from the bloodstream and storing it up as glycogen. So the liver stores a certain amount of glycogen, the muscles store some more. And in between meals, the muscles will happily run off their own glycogen, and the liver releases glycogen into the bloodstream so that the brain and other glucose-dependent tissues can have some of that. But our liver glycogen stores run out fairly quickly, and the muscles are miserly. Muscles don't share their glycogen stores with anybody else. They keep it for themselves. So once the liver sort of reaches a critical point in terms of its glycogen supply, it then directs a process called gluconeogenesis. So glucose, neo, new, and genesis, the creation of. So gluconeogenesis is the creation of new glucose from stuff that wasn't glucose, stuff that wasn't carbohydrate. And so we're able to turn certain amino acids from protein into glucose. They're called glucogenic amino acids. And we're also able to turn glycerol, which is formed when we break down triglycerides from fat, that can be turned into glucose as well. So gluconeogenesis hums along for the next several hours, up to a day or so, after we stop taking any kind of carbohydrate or have very low carbohydrate intake. And gluconeogenesis will keep the brain going for a while. But because gluconeogenesis is heavily dependent on protein as the sort of as what we call a substrate, like the basis for making that glucose, the liver kind of goes, well, this is bad. We don't want to break down too much protein. Protein's very precious. So the body then switches over to ketone production. So again, this is coordinated by the liver. By this stage, the fat reserves, the fat depots in the body are releasing large amounts of fat into the bloodstream to use as a fuel. The brain cannot just use fatty acids as a fuel. Muscles can. Muscles are very adaptable. So is the heart. So there are some tissues that will switch over to burning just fat, just triglycerides, but the brain can't. So now the liver is going to turn some of those triglycerides into ketone bodies, put those into the bloodstream. The brain takes them up, and now the brain switches over to burning mostly ketone bodies. The brain still requires a small amount of glucose. There's an obligatory usage of glucose because the brain can't run entirely on ketone bodies. It needs some glucose for efficiency. And so there's a little bit of protein breakdown that remains. And this, by the way, what I'm describing here is a total fast, right? So if someone takes in no calories at all, this is what will happen. And by the way, that's why we even have ketosis. That's why we make ketone bodies. This is an adaptation to food shortage or a total absence of food, which humans are able to make, early in our evolutionary period. So muscles running primarily off triglyceride, brain now running off ketone bodies, and the organism can kind of keep going like that until such time as the fat reserves entirely run out, and then you're going to starve to death.
Okay, gotcha. That was really, really clear. So
good.
So let me ask my stupid questions. So it sounds like that the ketogenesis, the creation of ketone bodies, isn't something that happens on a gradient. That like, okay, I don't eat for an hour, so I'm going to make a little bit. I don't eat for 4 hours, I'm going to make a little bit more. It's like there's an on-off switch, right? It's kind of binary.
No, there is a gradient effect. So there's a small amount of ketone bodies that are formed just in the course of everyday living. If there are fairly large gaps in between meals. So say if you have a fairly long overnight fast, 12, 13, 14 hours without food overnight. That's not as long as many people are doing now with the popularity of various forms of intermittent fasting, but you'll get a small amount of ketone formation. But the state of ketosis really describes where the brain is running off ketone bodies as its primary fuel source. So that will not happen until such time as glucose stores and glycogen stores are really depleted. So there is a grading effect, but we reach maximum ketone body production at around about, I think it's about 8 to 10 days into a total fast is when ketone production reaches its max. And then it just plateaus at that point.
Gotcha. So do you have a sense of like what's the purpose of ketones at 12 or 13 hours of a fast? Is it sort of just to prime the body in case this is the start of a really bad week, or do ketones have a function in our sort of everyday healthy metabolism?
Think of keeping a backup generator. A hospital has to have a reliable electricity supply, and say there's a storm and the electricity supply is cut off. We've got all these people who are on ventilators and machines that are keeping them alive, and there are surgeons who might be doing an operation in the middle of this electrical storm, and so they have to have a backup power source. They have, say, a diesel generator. So it's not as efficient, and they can use it just to keep everybody alive. But as soon as possible, they want to get back on the grid. That's how ketone bodies function for us. It's essentially that. It's that backup power supply. They're certainly utilizable by various tissues, but they're not the preferred tissues. They're not the preferred fuel source, even for the tissues that use them. I think a very interesting example of this is that young babies do use ketone bodies to fuel their brain. This is when they're newborn to around 6 months. As the human brain grows and becomes more complex, and we're using it for a lot more tasks than just, eating and pooping and crying, then the relative proportion of glucose that the brain uses rises dramatically. So in other words, complex activities of the brain are very dependent on glucose rather than ketone bodies. So you might say the high functions of the brain are what are lost or compromised when a person is in ketosis. And again, looking at the evolutionary background to this, that makes sense. If early humans were in ketosis when they were essentially starving, this wasn't going to be a time when they were, making up poems and stories or carrying out rituals to sort of bond their tribe. They were hungry and they were looking for food. So it's kind of like that reptilian brain is function entirely well on ketone bodies. Look for food. What can we do to survive? But anything that you might say is higher functions is pretty compromised when the brain doesn't have enough glucose.
Gotcha. So when I think about like intermittent fasting, and I came off a 7-day water fast a few weeks ago. That's when I released a pretty raw podcast episode that you might say was based on, it was maybe less reflective and more raw than usual. So maybe that was my version of look for food.
It was actually one of my favorite episodes so far. Just saying.
Oh, thanks. Some of our filters maybe aren't so useful all the time. So when I think about intermittent fasting, I think about something that is a stressor that we don't want to do all the time, but we also want to do it sometimes. Like, just like working our muscles to failure is a stressor. But we don't want to become fragile, right? We want to stress ourselves strategically and intermittently, and maybe so that like that's saying like what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. However,
there's actually a term for that in biology. It's called hormesis, or a hormetic stress, and which is pretty much defined as whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So definitely exercise is a hormetic stress. And yeah, I would agree, fasting is a hormetic stress as well. The fact is we are adapted to do it. And our modern environment doesn't provide us with the, you might say, natural opportunities to practice it. So now we have to voluntarily do it.
Uh-huh. Okay, that was my question, whether ketosis occasionally was more like exercise or more like cutting ourselves with a rusty blade, which is...
It's interesting that many of the benefits that we see with fasting, with water-only fasting, are extraordinarily similar to the benefits documented with exercise. You know, for instance, enhanced glucose tolerance and kind of like a recalibration of the autonomic nervous system. So in that sense, I think we can certainly say that the state of fasting, which involves more than ketosis, by the way, although water-only fasting is definitely dependent on the capacity to go into ketosis. But so there's more to fasting than just ketosis, but it is probable that running on ketosis for limited periods of time may be part of that hormetic stress situation.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So there was this diet that way back in the 1920s that was 90% fat, 6% protein, 4% carbohydrates, which to me sounds like not much fun. And
no.
And even when I was eating at my worst, like that doesn't sound like fun for anybody.
There are two major problems with the ketogenic diet applied to epilepsy. One is just what they call a lack of dietary tolerance. Kids can't stand it. It's disgusting. It tastes awful. They really jones for carbs. And the other thing is that there are some massive gastroenterological side effects. So nausea, for instance, they get diarrhea. They become more prone to gallstones. And there are some fairly nasty cardiovascular side effects as well. So cardiomyopathy, where the muscles of the heart weaken, has been a cause for quite a number of people, of epileptics who are being treated with this diet to have to drop out of treatment. And also cardiac arrhythmias, I should say, as well. And people do die doing this ketogenic diet. I remember reading case reports of lipoid pneumonia where people actually aspirate fat into the lungs and then develop pneumonia and die. So, you know, it's not without its problems. Mm-hmm. And as I say, like as soon as people are seizure-free for, you know, the requisite period of time, they can't wait to get back on carbohydrates.
Okay. So given that this was a disgusting, harmful diet that only was used for people for whom the potential benefits outweighed all the side effects and risks, how the hell did this get so popular?
That's a really good question. Now, I can answer that in several ways. The first way is that was the classic ketogenic diet, and since then, multiple variants of it have been developed, and they involve more protein, slightly less fat, you know, a higher carbohydrate content, and so they're somewhat more palatable. And then the other thing is, the other explanation is that sometimes humans just do really deeply weird stuff. I was listening to an interview with David Goldman the other day, and he was talking about, he's an exercise physiologist for those who don't know, who was formerly at True North Health Centre. And he was talking about a study that he'd read where people who were put on a ketogenic diet, their exercise performance was tested. And those who actually had the worst exercise performance rated themselves as feeling the best and having the fastest recovery. And his theory for this is that, and I thought it was pretty interesting, was that if there's this adaptation that kicks in when you're starving, and if it keeps going, you're going to die. If there's kind of a kindness built into the system that at least you might die happy. In other words, you know, you might kind of feel deluded enough that actually everything's going pretty well while you're dying. So, that is not being tested out to the best of my knowledge, but it's an interesting hypothesis. So in other words, people might be in a delusional state while in ketosis.
Well, if you say it affects, you know, brain function, then You know, like one, I guess, you know, one of the main qualities of being impaired is that you aren't aware that you're impaired.
Yes, I think it's also interesting that every religious and spiritual tradition that I know of incorporates fasting practices, and mostly they're not as full tilt as a you know a lengthy water only fast, but sometimes it is. And so when people fast for long periods of time and have what they perceive to be spiritual experiences, are they having spiritual experiences or are they having delusions? I don't know. I mean, how do you even answer that question? It's intriguing.
Right. I guess it goes to whether you think our brains, when they're working the way they're supposed to, are they apprehending reality or distorting it?
Are we all in the matrix?
Right. Right. So I mean that's also really interesting because like one of the mantras that I hear from, and I know you and I have talked before, and you described yourself as a recovering naturopath. So,
Yes.
so you know that one of the favorite mantras of naturopathy is like, you know, bio-individuality, and you know, see how this makes you feel. And like we can do objective measures. We can put someone on a keto diet and see that, okay, they suck at bicycling or running or the stress test. And if we know this and we're still letting them get away with, oh yeah, I think I feel great. I'm euphoric now. I'm Superman.
And let's face it, alcohol can make you feel better. Cocaine, I'm sure, I haven't done it personally. It's very expensive.
Yeah.
But I'm sure when people snort coke, they feel better. And when people, well, at least when smokers smoke cigarettes, they definitely feel better. When people drink coffee, they feel better. But the question is, are they getting better or are they merely feeling better? And that's why we have science. That's why we have objective tests, so that we can put people on a treadmill and see how long it takes for them to run to exhaustion. We can check their max VO2 and all that sort of stuff. And we could also have objective measures how quickly they recover, which was one of the other things that was noted in the study that David Goldman was talking about. And of course, then we have long-term follow-up studies to actually objectively track how people do over time with various diet and lifestyle habits.
Mm-hmm. So my understanding, and I don't know that I have science to back this up, is that, but I certainly anecdotally, like people that I talk to who are doing Atkins or low carb, almost all of them fail and blame themselves.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
interesting.
So it sounds like, you know, if we took these kids in the 1920s who are epileptics who are trying to get this stuff down, that you'd probably have the same, you know, high dropout rate of the study. But at least people go, you know what, this is almost untenable and disgusting. But now we have, like, what does, I don't even know, like, what does a ketogenic diet look like? Like, I went to a Frisbee tournament with a bunch of my buddies, several of whom are doing keto. So we went shopping. You know, I got avocados and kale and sweet potatoes. They got milk and like 4 cartons of eggs and lots of bacon. And like that was their breakfast before we went and ran around for 4 hours. So
for starters, most people who say that they're quote unquote doing keto are not doing anything remotely approximating a ketogenic diet. I mean, if you're doing a ketogenic diet, as in what is prescribed for epilepsy, you're weighing and measuring every morsel of food that you eat. You're using keto sticks to actually check that you're in ketosis. In the case of someone with epilepsy, if they slip out of ketosis at any stage during the day, it actually compromises the efficacy of the treatment, and they're likely to have a seizure. So most people who say they're doing keto are having a lot more carbohydrate and usually a lot more protein, because don't forget, certain amino acids in protein can be converted into glucose. So if most of the people who are doing what they think is a ketogenic diet are actually having far too much protein to be genuinely in ketosis. What actually does a ketogenic diet consist of? It's a lot of oil, a lot of just foods that are extremely high in fat and low in carbohydrate and low in protein as well.
So like oil, lard,
Yeah, I mean, milk, for instance, has carbohydrate in the form of lactose. So I can't see how that would fit into a truly ketogenic diet.
So I guess when people say they're doing keto, they're not talking about classic keto or even any
No,
of the...
they're not. But even the variants of the classic ketogenic diet that involve a little more protein and carbohydrate is still not what the average person who thinks they're doing keto is doing.
Mm-hmm. So is this just a marketing label thrown over eat lots of animal foods?
In my observation of it, yes.
I guess that's it. Like we're fighting a straw man here.
It's like John McDougall always says, people love to hear good news about their bad habits. So if you love bacon, you're going to look for a diet that justifies your consumption of bacon. And so Atkins is a bit old hat now. No one really talks about doing Atkins anymore. And some versions of, well, I mean, bacon definitely does not fit into a Paleolithic diet because, newsflash, humans were not curing pig meat and consuming that. So what is the only diet that's sort of currently doing the rounds that really justifies your consumption of bacon? Well, it's keto. So if you love bacon, looks like keto is the diet for you. I'm being a little flippant, but I mean, like I said, people who claim to be doing keto aren't. So what are they doing? They're just they're applying a label to their preferred pattern of food consumption.
Mm-hmm. And so it's based on sort of fear, carbophobia, right? Like
carbophobia, exactly.
Right. So if I can't, potatoes, corn, rice, beans because of the lectins, so that's all off. I don't want to do the clearly junky foods, like
yes,
right. So I'm not going to do donuts and cookies, or at least not when anyone's looking. So that leaves my steaks, my hot dogs, my hamburgers without the bun, my bacon, and my cheese.
Lettuce burgers.
Right, my cheese omelets.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So why aren't these people dropping dead in front of me? Like they're it's okay. So they're if they did a stress test or performance test, it would impair. But like these guys are in pretty good shape. The people I know who are doing it.
It's a testimony to the extraordinary resilience of the human body. It really is. Now, what's happening, of course, is really within days of adopting a ketogenic diet, you're going to see impairments to endothelial function. This has been documented, by the way. So endothelial function is impaired, which the endothelium is the inner lining of the arteries. I know you know this, but for the listener, the endothelium is the inner lining of our arteries, and it's responsible for maintaining the health of the arteries, dilating the arteries when required to facilitate extra blood flow, safer exercise. The endothelium is also the endothelium has to be in good shape to prevent atherosclerosis, or the buildup of a cholesterol-laden, fatty, calcified plaque on the inner lining of the arteries. And we know from the studies that have been done that a ketogenic diet impairs endothelial function, and it dramatically impairs cardiac blood flow as well. But if you're young and in pretty good shape, then it's going to take many years for the results of the ketogenic diet on your cardiovascular system to show up as a heart attack or even erectile dysfunction, although that will be the first thing that shows up. Mm-hmm. Just because of the relative narrowness of the penile artery compared to the coronary arteries.
Uh-huh. Gotcha. So maybe they're so good at Frisbee because they don't have sex anymore. They're more focused.
I don't know. You'd have to ask them about that. Would you get an honest answer? I don't know.
Yeah.
I haven't been privy to those kinds of discussions among men.
Right. I'll go undercover and get back to you. But the other thing that really flummoxes me is like people like scientists, people who have good brains and I'm sure are not trying to sell anything. They're trying to tell the truth. I'm reading a lot of books where people are kind of in adjacent fields to nutrition, and they're really smart about their fields, and they're trumpeting the benefits of the ketogenic diet. So one example I'll name, I'd love to get him on the podcast, he hasn't responded so far, is Sachin Panda, who's a doctor out of California who does amazing work about the circadian rhythms, the circadian biology. And I'm telling people to read his book because it's phenomenal. And I'm also telling them, please ignore everything he says about food.
Yes, yes. So do you remember that book you wrote with T. Colin Campbell, Whole?
Yeah.
One of my favorite books of all time. It's reductionism. This is reductionism in full flight. So in other words, reductionism, again, as you know, this is for the benefit of the listener, is this narrowing down the focus, like narrowing the aperture so that we look at just a small fragment of the overall picture. And so, I mean, the reality is if you put people on a ketogenic diet, there are certain biomarkers which are going to improve. Their blood glucose level will drop. I mean, if you're a diabetic and your blood glucose level is off the charts and you go on a ketogenic diet, there's no doubt about it. Your blood glucose level is going to drop because you're not having carbohydrates. So, of course, your blood sugar level is going to drop. Do you say in America, or is that uniquely Australian?
Is it the same as duh?
Kind of. I guess we have that's our hangover from the British influence. We say it duh. So yeah, duh. I'll say it duh.
Oh no, stay with duh.
So, yeah, you do see improvements in blood glucose level. There are some what look like improvements in glucose metabolism, such as what's called insulin area under the curve. There's obviously a drop in fasting insulin production as well, because without carbohydrate, the requirement to secrete insulin is much lower. And if people lose weight on a ketogenic diet, which they commonly do, and not by the way because there's some magic metabolic advantage to ketogenic diets. That's really been comprehensively disproven by Kevin Hall with his truly marvelous, magical, beautiful, elegant metabolic ward studies. He's shown that there is no metabolic advantage to the ketogenic diet. In other words, it's a weight loss diet that works because people eat less calories. Mm-hmm. There's no magic to it, okay? But if people lose weight, you in most cases, you're going to see a drop in cholesterol. And so we do see that with ketogenic diets. It's not as impressive as you'd see if a person lost weight on a whole food plant-based diet, but just losing weight will drop down your cholesterol level. So there are improvements in biomarkers, no doubt about it. And, of course, Sachin Panda, his research is done on mice and rats. And rodents are not humans. So when we try to extrapolate our results that we gain on rodents to humans, there's usually a very large shortfall. Rodent models provide pretty interesting starting points, but then you've got to take it to the humans, which is what Kevin Hall does so fabulously well.
Gotcha. So we have these. Blood glucose will drop, insulin area under the curve. Can you explain that one?
It's really just the amount of insulin that needs to be secreted over time to return the blood glucose level to normal. Mm-hmm. So if a person is very insulin resistant, and that's the hallmark of type 2 diabetes, but by the way, it does also develop over time with most type 1s, then if a person is insulin resistant, pancreas will have to secrete a lot more insulin to try to get that blood glucose level back down to normal again.
Okay. So my understanding of certainly insulin resistant diabetes is that it's a disease of too much fat in the muscles.
It starts off with too much fat in the muscles, and fat then accumulates in the liver as well, and eventually fat accumulates in the pancreas itself. And those little pockets of fat that are invading the muscle tissue, the liver tissue, and the pancreatic tissue are highly inflammatory. And so this accumulation of fat within the pancreas actually produces inflammatory chemicals that kill beta cells, the insulin-secreting cells.
So over time that becomes what, type 1.5?
Well, yeah, eventually. So what happens with type 2s is initially they're secreting enormous amounts of insulin, 2, 5, even 10 times as much insulin as a non-diabetic person. And provided their pancreas can keep up with that, then they will maintain a relatively normal glucose level. They're still diabetic, but they're coping. Eventually their pancreas will just poop out. It's simply, so if you kill off enough beta cells, you just can't produce that amount of insulin. And so at that point, they're likely to become insulin dependent. They'll actually have to start injecting insulin, even though they're type 2s.
Okay. So, I mean, where I'm going with this is you just listed a whole bunch of biomarkers related to diabetes that improve on a ketogenic diet, and yet pretty much every ketogenic diet will contribute to what I understand to be the galloping underlying cause of the disease. So I'm having a little, like, my brain is smoking. Like it helps with biomarkers, absolutely. But it makes the disease worse.
Yes, again, and this is the perils of reductionism. So in the short term, and remember, these studies on diabetes, we don't have anything that goes past, I believe, I have to check the studies, but I don't think we have anything that goes past 2 years. And most of them are 6 months or less. So what you see is this short-term improvement in biomarkers. But look, nobody dies of diabetes. People die of diabetic complications. There are macrovascular complications, which are things like heart attacks and strokes. And then there are microvascular complications, which is mostly retinopathy, eye disease, kidney disease and nerve disease. So the kidney disease can kill you. The eye disease makes you blind, which is awful. And the neuropathy is highly unpleasant, but again, probably won't kill you. So what we actually need is to figure out, well, what is the best way for diabetics to eat that will save them from diabetic complications, especially atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease, because that's the major cause of death in diabetics. They have about 4 times the risk of heart attack as a non-diabetic, and heart attacks are already the leading cause of death in westernized countries.
Okay, so the biomarker studies say that most are about 6 months. So do we have study? I mean, it feels like keto has taken such hold, and I think it's because it sounds more impressive, right? Yeah.
So I'm going to loop back to something you said before, which is that people that you know who've tried this eventually fail. Fail meaning they eat carbohydrates again, which, by the way, is not surprising, because carbohydrates are the preferred food source of the human being. They're the primary macronutrient that made up the bulk of our diet throughout our evolutionary history. So, in other words, we're unlikely to get long-term studies where people are fully compliant with a ketogenic diet, so that we can find out exactly what I just said, like, how do people do if they stick consistently to a ketogenic diet and they say diabetic. What we do know from epidemiological studies is that people who eat a low carbohydrate diet have a higher mortality rate. They are more likely to die. So that doesn't bode well if you already have a chronic degenerative disease like type 2 diabetes, which is going to shorten your life expectancy anyway. So we have kind of like a proxy measure for what happens when people do a long-term carbohydrate-restricted diet. Now, I'm not saying that we have studies of a long-term ketogenic diet, because we don't, because people can't stick to it. They do it for a couple of months at a stretch, and then they just can't stand it anymore.
So this is like someone saying that holding your breath for 2 years has never killed anyone.
Correct.
Wow, that's insane.
It kind of is. Like I said, humans do crazy stuff. The remarkable range of human craziness never ceases to amuse me, entertain me, and flabbergast me.
Oh, awesome. Well, I feel like we've anyone who's listening to this who is convincible has been convinced to not do this keto madness. Could we switch gears for the last little bit? I'd love to find out what you discovered in your research on moderated Facebook groups, and specifically, and tell us what the question is and what you found.
Yeah. So last time we spoke, I was in the midst of my honours research project. It's my prep for starting my PhD, and I decided to do my honours project on this particular Facebook group called Whole Food Plant Based Aussies. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, we do accept Kiwis as honorary Aussies for these purposes. You're very welcome to join this group. We have a few non-Australians, but mostly we accept Aussies. So if you're on a whole food plant-based diet and you want some support, join this group. Okay, so my research question was basically, does membership of a Facebook group such as this with a really dedicated purpose, does it facilitate people in adopting and particularly maintaining a whole food plant-based diet? And the short answer is yes. The longer answer is a lot more interesting, just in terms of exactly what it is that people get out of group membership. And it's everything from just information sharing on the most, I suppose, simple of levels. For example, what do you eat on a whole food plant-based diet? Because, people can read the China study, they can read Whole, they can read any number of great books on a whole food plant-based diet. And then they close the book and they say, well, that's great, I'm sold, I'll start tomorrow. What the heck do I eat? Mm-hmm. And so people often post photos of their meals in Facebook groups, and this one's no exception. But the great thing about this group is that the meals aren't all prettied up. They're not like Instagram photos. They're just like someone whacked the food on a plate and it was beans and rice and a bit of kale, or a baked potato with, some random veggies, and they snap a pic of it, and there's no floral arrangements and there's no lighting or whatever. It's just like, hey, this is what I had for dinner. It might look much, but it was good. Yeah. And people look at that and go, oh, so that's what you eat on a whole food plant-based diet. So for newbies, it's really good to see that not everyone is cooking up a gourmet storm every night of the week. It's if you like doing that sort of stuff and you find it fun, then knock yourself out. But most of us are just kind of whacking stuff on a plate, and it's fine. The other sort of major benefit that people get out of this group is just that kind of like that moral support, particularly if you're the only one in your family or in your workplace who's doing this. It's lonely, and the social pressure, the pressure to conform, the concern about how am I going to handle that the big family get together, what do I do when my mother-in-law makes this criticism about my diet, all that sort of stuff. People actually get enormous amounts of support through this Facebook group. The well-moderated part is really important, because people can behave incredibly badly in online, due to the anonymity of social media. And so this group, the admins run a very tight ship, and anyone who's nasty just gets booted out.
Right. Well, I was going to ask about that, because I'm involved in training coaches, so I've become very sensitive to like things that work and things that don't work. And like nobody, like a lot of people would never be nasty and they want to be helpful, and yet they can be extremely unhelpful. Yes. Sort of lay people. If someone says, "Oh, I did a bad meal," and they'll either, they'll say, "Oh, just shake it off," and like something like meant to make them feel well, but ultimately unhelpful. I'm curious, like, what are the qualities and the behaviors of moderators that you see as being particularly effective?
Yeah, okay, that's a really interesting question, because I interviewed one of the moderators as part of my research project, and the quality of a moderator is, look, it's a couple of things. Number one, they really keep the purpose of the group in mind. And so sometimes threads will get started where people are discussing things that are really kind of outside the scope of the group's purpose. And it may not be a nasty conversation, but it's really just unhelpful. Like, in other words, if you're posting pictures of a Beyond Burger product, and sort of oohing and ahhing over it. Okay, look, people might like that, but it doesn't really fit into a whole food plant-based diet. Mm-hmm. And so posts like that will actually get deleted. And sometimes members get a bit offended by that, but it's like, no, if you want to discuss that sort of stuff, there are tons of vegan Facebook groups that you could join. In terms of the issue that you just raised, because it's kind of interesting, when people do reach out, when they're having problems, or there's a dilemma and they're trying to, access the group mind to get help on it, they will receive a whole variety of different forms of advice. I've not really seen the moderators get involved in that. I think their perspective on that is, do you know what? Something out of this might serve not necessarily the person who posed the question, but perhaps someone else who is reading the thread. And so they tend not to intervene with that. So a moderator has a pretty finely tuned sensitivity to things that could upset people or offend them, things that are not relevant or appropriate or applicable to the group. And, let me see. It wasn't, to be honest, it wasn't really a focus of my research, but it is an intriguing question. I think there's always a question behind the question. You know what I'm saying? When a person posts a question in social media, I always find it difficult because I want to actually talk to them and find out what the question is behind the question.
Right.
And so I think, if I were the moderator, and often I do this because I'll just jump in and contribute to these questions as well. So when someone asks a question in a situation like that, I'll usually answer it by asking another question, a clarifying question. So I think that's probably a pretty good quality for a moderator to have, to be really curious about what is this person really asking? What is the problem behind the problem?
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So what kind of, do you have any data on people who dropped out? On like what, what they didn't get out of it, or what happened to them afterwards? Do people tend to want to, stay in for the long haul, or can they, is it like an umbilical cord that they can cut and go off on their own?
Yeah. So in the context of my research project, first of all, I did basically a text analysis of posts that people made, and then I did in-depth interviews. And look, I mean, obviously it was a self-selected sample. People put their hand up to be interviewed, and so they tended to be the ones who were happy with the group. Do people drop out of these groups? Absolutely. They might join the group out of curiosity. They've heard about a plant-based diet or a whole food plant-based diet. They want to know what it's all about, and then they decide it's not for them, and we never hear from them again. And they either leave the group, in which case I can't contact them to find out why, or they just become, they might still stay in the group, but they don't contribute regularly, in which case they're not going to respond to my request to interview them. So in other words, the scope of my research project didn't actually allow me to get in touch with people who decided, no, this group is not for me, because they weren't in the group anymore.
Uh-huh. So how has the research helped you?
Oh, that's an interesting question, isn't it? It's helped me. I suppose it's helped me answer a few questions about, is online support really a meaningful form of support compared to in-person support? That's a question that's really dogged researchers since the online world really blossomed and people started spending more of their time online rather than, with actual living, breathing human beings talking to them. And I'm not going to say that having an online support community is a substitute for having real life people that you meet up with for meals and go for runs with, because I don't think it is. But for people who are very isolated, geographically, for instance, we had members in the group who were in pretty far-flung parts of Australia, and there are parts of Australia that really are far from anywhere, and they were literally the only person that they knew who was not eating a sort of typical Australian diet. And for them, the group was absolutely a lifeline. It was, they'd log on several times a day and without, sometimes not even posting themselves. So they might just have been what is, rather an ugly term, lurker. They might have just been lurking. So, and that's another interesting thing, was that people don't actually have to actively participate to benefit. They can just be lurking, as in reading other people's posts, and they still report a benefit from group membership. So that was pretty interesting to me.
That's very cool. Anything you encountered about people finding this online community and then either finding or beginning to create real life community around themselves?
Yes, and yes, absolutely. So this is a large group where we're nearly at 10,000 members now, and certainly some people do live in reasonable proximity to each other. There have also been a couple of kind of offshoot groups. So members of this group have established meetup groups within their own cities or regions as part of Nelson Campbell's Plant Pure Pods. So we actually have Plant Powered Sydney and Plant Powered Melbourne and Plant Powered Brisbane and Plant Powered Perth and Adelaide, and we're starting to infiltrate the regional centres as well. And so there's a lot of cross membership of this particular group with these other groups, and therefore, if we're having a meetup for one of our sort of city-based groups, we can cross-promote that in the larger group. And so we end up sort of creating all these sort of satellite organizations, I suppose, where people can get that very needed face-to-face, sitting in the same room, sharing the meal with each other kind of contact, which I do think is really super important for human beings.
Gotcha. So do you have like a short list of do's and don'ts for someone who wants to create a group or jump in and fix a group that isn't working?
Yeah. So for starters, set really clear guidelines. Facebook groups now allow you to have up to 3 questions that people need to answer before they join, and that came into that Facebook provision came into this group about several years into its inception. So newer members now have to sort of jump this hurdle of answering questions to make sure that they actually understand what a whole food plant-based diet is, and that this particular group also embraces a no oil policy, because that tends to hose down all of the tedious arguments about is coconut oil or olive oil okay. They still pop up. It's amazing. Even after people have answered the questions and said, yes, I understand what the purpose of this group is, even then there'll still be questions like, why don't you eat olive oil in this group? Blows everyone's mind. But have questions. It at least weeds out a lot of that stuff of people just not understanding. What else? So if you're either founding a group or you're trying to fix a group that's sort of gone off the rails, you need to allocate a fair amount of time to actually be in the group and reading posts. This particular group has 5 moderators, and one of them is in Europe. So between the 5 of them, they cover different time zones. They're awake at different times of the day. And so if some discussion has sort of got a bit ugly and trouble is brewing in the group, there's always someone who's able to get in there and just hose it down, or, if necessary, delete particular posts if there's offensive language, or delete an entire thread if it's clearly just gone completely pear-shaped and there's no saving it. What else? How else do you save a group? If the group is not terribly active, the other thing is just posting interesting questions for people to answer, or posting articles. A lot of what happens in whole food plant-based policies is people, including moderators, just very engaged members of the group, will post interesting articles. So, if say Joel Kahn or David Katz or John McDougall, or someone's just written a really great article, or Doug Lyle has done an excellent webinar on some aspect of habit change, someone will actually just pop a link to that in the group, and then that often starts a discussion, and just it engages people more. So being involved, hosing down arguments before they get nasty. If necessary, evicting people from the group if they just won't play in the playground nicely. You do actually have to bump them off. And yeah, and it's kind of like having that awareness that the well-being of the group trumps individuals. So if one particular person is not getting their needs met in the group, but they're behaving badly because of that, the well-being of the group actually trumps their needs. And that's actually a little bit troubling for me. But my discussions with the group's founder, she was really clear on that. The group comes first. If individuals don't like it, tough.
Right. Well, you know, I mean, for what they're paying, it's pretty.
That's right. That was her point too. Is like, I do this for free. I'm a volunteer. So if people don't like the way I run the group, they can basically buzz off and start their own.
Right. Yeah, I learned it from my wife because she accidentally, not a group, but she had a Facebook page that got up to over 100,000 people, and she's like, "This is my living room. If you come in my house and you sit in my living room and you don't behave, you can't stay here." And
yes, exactly.
She became very quick to bump people off after a while.
Yes, yeah. No, if they won't behave, if they won't play nicely, then they don't belong. And it's also that kind of toxicity affects the group and the atmosphere of the group. You know, one of the most frequent comments that I got during the in-depth interviews that I did was that this is a really friendly group. And of course, Facebook being what it is, most people are in multiple groups. And so I spoke to people who were in very many other groups. And this was their favorite because of that friendly atmosphere. So that is the moderators or the admin's responsibility to maintain that atmosphere. Just to sort of give you a little bit of context to this. Am I allowed to swear on your podcast?
Please.
Okay. There is a Facebook group called Vegans in Australia Who Aren't Assholes, which developed as a splitters group from a group called Vegans in Australia. I'll leave you and your viewers to fill in the gaps about why Vegans in Australia Who Aren't Assholes was formed. But that's just a little taste of Facebook group life.
I'm still waiting for you to curse. I haven't heard any unacceptable language yet. That's great. So let's wrap this up. I'm curious, like what you're up to now. I know you wrote to me that you took a international lifestyle medicine exam, part of the first Aussie cohort. Like what are you up to, and how can people find you?
Yeah, I was just off the back of submitting my honours thesis, and a month later, a month or 6 weeks later, the Australasian College of Australasian Society of Lifestyle Medicine were running the very first exam to become a certified lifestyle medicine practitioner. So I hit the books again and did this exam, which, by the way, was about the most hideous exam I've ever sat in my life, and I've sat a few. It was just truly awful. So anyway, I'm now an officially.
In what way was it? Was just really hard or irrelevant?
Oh, it was multiple choice questions that were just completely twisted. Multiple choice exams that I can remember from way back in high school. It was like there was always two answers that were clearly wrong, and one that was probably wrong, and then the other usually stood out like the proverbial dog's balls. But this one was just, how can we write the question in the most convoluted way to trip you up? But I managed to pass, yes. Right. So now I'm officially a certified lifestyle medicine practitioner. And what am I up to? I took a hiatus from studies on. I am going to begin my PhD next year, and I haven't quite settled on the topic, but I'm really, really interested in behavior change. So that's what I'm probably going to end up focusing on.
Well, if you're looking for a cohort to study, I would love to give you access to WellStart.
That sounds amazing. Good. I will talk to my potential supervisors about that because I've been kicking around a few ideas in my mind and haven't quite settled on anything. So, all right, I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah.
Other than that, I'm running my practice as usual. I'm busy writing articles every week, as you know, and I'm also I know you have the Holistic Holiday at Sea that's been running in the US for a number of years. Well, our first version of that in Australia is running in October, and I'm going to be one of the cruise presenters. It's called and now I'm having a mental blank. What is the name of this event? It'll come to me in a sec. But if you look up plantbasedcruise.com.au, for those who want to sort of just squeak under the line, plantbasedcruise.com.au. And so that will be the first kind of, it is a whole food plant-based cruise. So there's going to be lots of lectures and whole food cooking demos. And I'll be speaking about the gut microbiome and, psychosocial factors in cardiovascular disease and behavior change and a bunch of other things. So that's what I'm up to in October. In this month, next week, I'm flying over to San Diego for the Plant-Based Nutrition Healthcare Conference, and I believe you're going.
I'll see you there.
So we get to do a face-to-face, which will be fun.
Awesome.
Your first time, right?
In San Diego?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your first time at this conference?
Yes. I'm doing Plantrition, and then in October I'm doing the ACLM conference in Indianapolis. So I'm
I haven't got to their one yet. Yeah. It sounds amazing.
Yeah.
This is my first time at the Plant-Based Nutrition Healthcare Conference. I'm a repeat offender. It is my favorite conference to go to because, and this is going to sound weird, but people hug. You don't normally go to medical conferences where people hug, but there is a lot of hugging going on at this conference, and it's cool.
Yeah, well, the way they eat, they probably don't smell very bad.
That's a good point. And all of those greens and beans feed up their good gut bacteria and just produce all the serotonin and make them really happy. That's my theory.
Cool. Well, that could be your other PhD thesis. So.
I have considered that, as a matter of fact, the effects of a whole food plant-based diet on the gut microbiome and how that affects mood. It's on my radar. I have a potential PhD supervisor for that.
Awesome. And tell us one more time your website so people can follow you.
Yes, it's empowertotalhealth.com.au, and I have a weekly free newsletter. Every now and again I post a video on YouTube. I'm not very active on that, but you can check out my YouTube channel, which is Empower Total Health. I've got a Facebook page, look up Empower Total Health, and I tweet a bit, not a heck of a lot, not nearly as much as Donald Trump, but I do every now and again tweet.
Well, I'm sure yours are adding to the positivity in the world. So there's another distinction.
I should hope so.
All right. Well, Robyn, thank you so much. I'm so excited. I'm going to meet you next week, and
it's going to be fun.
Yeah, and I'm so happy that you've put together this long series on ketogenic diets, and I think this is gonna help a lot of people. So I hope and kind of you threw out lots of references to different things, and if someone goes to the articles, like half of the words are in blue, which means you're linking to the references you're talking about. So this is not you just making shit up.
I don't write anything that I don't reference. I have this, I suppose it's a paranoid streak in me. I'm always afraid that someone's going to sort of email me and say, hey, why did you say this? I'm like, it wasn't me, it was the researcher. Here it is. So whenever I write an article, it's fully referenced. You can go back to the original literature and read it. And I highly recommend that people do that.
Yep. It's a great way to cover our asses. And be more credible than the people promoting these crazy diets.
Yeah, sorry, my third world Australian internet speed's just cranking down now. Could you say that last bit again?
Yeah. I was saying it allows us to be more credible. That because we're in a debate, right? And it's a crazy debate. But like, what, you know, how can we distinguish ourselves? We say, well, you know, when you're looking at the other side, like follow their links, because otherwise it's he said, she said. You have to, you know,
Yes,
if we're
absolutely.
if you're going to empower total health, you have to empower people to evaluate research at some level.